Whether or not psychology is seen as a science is an important debate, and it's one that's included on the AQA A-level psychology specification. It's included in the research methods section for paper 2, although actually it really is more of a debate. We're talking about the extent to which psychology can be seen as a science, or the extent to which it's not a science, and maybe it's just a social science, which is something different. One of the key things we need for science is scientific terminology. So on this screen are some of the terminology that you will need when you're talking about psychology as a science. So things like talking about scientific methods, and the most scientific method is of course the experiment. Science needs to be deductive. So we're looking at our evidence and we're coming to conclusions based on our evidence. It needs to be objective. So we need to be clear about what we're looking at. We can't be subjective. It isn't about opinions. Things need to be, well, our variables need to be measurable. And that's when we talk about operationalizing our variables, stating them in a clearly measurable form. Experiments are all about establishing cause and effect. And of course, our research should be replicable. It should be easy for someone else to replicate what we've done and see if they get the same results, to see if it's consistent. It also needs to be falsifiable. Can we falsify someone's theory? Because no theory in science is ever final. It's only a theory until we find evidence that suggests a new theory. Science should have a predictive power. We should be able to predict what will happen in the future, how people might behave in similar situations. So therefore, psychology that is scientific should be nomothetic. It should be able to predict general laws. And finally, we have the concept of paradigms and paradigm shifts, which we'll discuss a little bit later. An acronym that I find really helps students when they're answering any questions on psychology as a science is the acronym FORCE. So F for falsification, O for being objective, R for replication, C for causation, and E can be for empirical evidence or experiments. So if you remember that little acronym and then you're answering a question, that will remind you what key features of science to try and bring into your answer. So why is it important whether or not psychology is a science? Well, in our society and culture, science has a very high value. I'm sure many of you remember during the COVID-19 pandemic, the phrase follow the science was used a lot. It was about we need to be scientific, we need to listen to the scientists. So science uses an empirical approach, and what we mean by that is evidence-based, and that evidence comes through our 5 senses. In psychology, we use experimental and non-experimental methods, and it's those experimental methods that are considered to be much more scientific because they are objective and they are based on empirical knowledge, things that we can experience through our 5 senses. We need to consider the philosophy behind science. The word science simply means knowledge, and that doesn't really help us much because with that definition, science is anything. The American philosopher Thomas Kuhn said that science should have a shared set of assumptions, use scientific methods, and have its own terminology. Well, psychology definitely has 2 out of 3. It uses scientific methods, it uses experiments, it has its own terminology. We use terms like reliability and validity. However, where psychology falls down on Kuhn's definition of a science is having one set of assumptions to explain human behaviour. Psychology has a number of competing assumptions and explanations. So for instance, the biological approach, the cognitive approach, the social approach, the behaviorist approach, the psychodynamic approach, the humanist approach. And for Kuhn, that is the reason that psychology is not seen as a science, but instead is a social science. When we're talking about scientific paradigms, paradigm is an underlying theory or unifying theory or a set of beliefs. So to give you an example from the physical sciences, the scientific paradigm used to be that the world was flat. Most people agreed the world was flat. Evidence arose from Galileo and from sailors sailing around the world that actually the world isn't flat, it's round. And then we have what's called a paradigm shift. Most people start to believe then that the world is round, not flat. The same's happened in psychology. In the 60s, behaviorism was an underlying theme in psychology. There was an argument that everything would be learnt. Then we moved on more to social psychology and cognitive psychology, and now the paradigm is shifting very much in the direction of cognitive neuroscience. So although we have competing assumptions, we do have assumptions that are dominant at any one time in history. The other important part of psychology as a science is Karl Popper's idea of falsification. So this is the idea that we can prove something false. So Popper famously said the idea or the paradigm, if you like, that all swans are white can be falsified by observing just one black swan. And it's this area of falsification where the psychodynamic approach falls down. The idea of unconscious motivation, the existence of the id, the ego, and the superego cannot be falsified. And this led Popper to label the psychodynamic approach as pseudoscience or fake science because there's no objective evidence. It can't be falsified. Types of questions that you might get. Remember in AQA you can get research methods questions on any section. So this one came up on paper 1 under the social psychology section. Researchers have identified different features of science, including replicability, theory construction, and hypothesis testing. Explain how Ash's conformity research illustrates one of these features of science, and it's 3 marks. So a good rule of thumb on short mark questions is to try and write 1 substantial sentence per mark. So what we need really here is point, explain, an example. And of course our example is going to come from Ash. So PEE, point, explain, example for our 3 marks. So we need to signpost to the examiner which of those 3 features we're going to use. So I've chosen to use the example of replicability. So we can say, Ash designed a highly controlled lab experiment to test conformity. He had a detailed, standardized procedure to ensure full replication was possible. This means that his research was able to be replicated to test the reliability of his findings. And we could elaborate a little bit more if we wanted to, but it's not necessary. It's been replicated many times and been shown to be reliable, as similar results have been found. So if you follow that PEE when it's a 3 mark question, you won't go far wrong. This question came up on paper 2 under research methods, and this is a more traditional question. It's an 8 marker. So we've got 3 marks for AO1, which is basically what are the features of science, 2 marks for refer using an example, and then 3 marks for your evaluation. Now, because this is a debate, is psychology a science or isn't it a science? We want evidence from each side. So we want evidence that psychology is a science and evidence that it isn't. So at AO1, I've used Kuhn's research here, but you could use anything. It doesn't matter as long as you're explaining what it means to be scientific. I've then continued with an argument for. So I've made my point. Much of psychology is clearly scientific as it tests hypotheses using the experimental method. Variables are controlled, operationalized, and measured in an objective manner. So discussing there the features of science. I've then used an example to illustrate my point. So, for example, psychology, which takes a biological approach, is very scientific. Maguire's study measures the volume of grey matter in the hippocampi of experienced taxi drivers using MRI scans. She produced a reliable finding that could be replicated and produced objective data. So linking Maguire clearly to those features of science and explaining why her research is scientific. Our next evaluation point is going to be why psychology might not be a science. So, however, because we're putting the opposite side of the argument, human behaviour is so rich and varied that it cannot always be studied using the scientific method. For example, much cognitive psychology is studying thought processes, and this cannot be studied objectively. It's subjective, and we have to infer thoughts from behaviour or ask people, and this raises issues of demand, characteristics, and social desirability. I've also used a second example here, so you could choose which one you wanted to use. Karl Popper argues that a feature of science is falsifiability. The psychodynamic approach cannot be falsified as unconscious motivation, the id, ego, and superego, cannot be falsified or proven to exist either. Freud is considered unscientific because of his research methods too. Case studies on a few individuals, therefore taking an idiographic rather than a nomothetic approach, meaning we can't generalize to the whole population and make predictions. Now, as this question is about a debate, arguments, is it a science or isn't it a science, it's appropriate to put a conclusion. Now, most of the time in AQA with extended writing, you don't need a conclusion, but I would make an exception with debates, because we need to round it off. So, in conclusion, psychology is a science as it mainly uses scientific methods, and then we can put the counter bit. However, human behaviour is so rich and diverse, it cannot always be studied like chemicals in a test tube, and it's this diversity which makes psychology such an interesting and challenging subject. So I hope that's helped your understanding of psychology as a science, and I hope you now feel prepared to answer any exam questions that might come up on this. So thank you for your attention.